You have made it here to learn about cold, not the brief cold of a walk from car to door or the temporary cold of waiting for heat to switch on. Deeper cold, the kind that families in 1700s America lived inside for months at a time, through nights that lasted 14 hours while temperatures outside fell towards zero and inside dropped to 40 degrees. The kind where frost formed on the inside of windows and breath turned visible in bedchambers, and staying warm until morning required knowledge, preparation, and layers of wool and feather piled heavy enough to press sleep into you. This is the story of how they slept. Not comfortably, but successfully, night after night, winter after winter, in wooden houses that leaked wind through gaps in walls, on beds designed not for rest, but for survival, using fire and fabric and the warmth of other bodies to make it through darkness. Let us follow one household on one evening as snow begins to fall, and they prepare not just for sleep, but for the work of staying warm enough to see morning. The house stood where forest had been cleared, wood frame, clapboard siding, a central chimney of stone and clay rising through the middle like a spine. One large room below, perhaps two smaller chambers above, if the family had prosperity. This was a working farmhouse in Massachusetts or Connecticut, built in the 1730s, home to a family of 6, not wealthy, not destitute, middling people with 40 acres and livestock and the skills to keep themselves fed and sheltered. As afternoon faded toward evening in January, you could see what the house truly was. A box of wood in a landscape of snow and bare trees. Smoke rose steady from the chimney. 2 windows on the front wall, small, perhaps 16 inches square, with actual glass, though wavy and thick. The door, plank oak, fitted well enough, but not perfectly. Winter found the gaps. Inside, the main room served as kitchen, workroom, dining space and gathering place. The hearth occupied most of one wall, its opening large enough for a grown man to stand inside. Stone surrounded it. The chimney mass extended back into the wall, and that stone, warmed slowly through the day by fire, would hold heat for hours. This was the only source of warmth for the entire structure. The floor was wide pine planks, bare wood worn smooth by years of feet and swept clean of ash and debris. Between planks, gaps, not large, but present. Cold air rose through those gaps from the crawl space below, where fieldstone foundation piers held the house above frozen ground. Families sometimes banked the foundation with straw or corn stalks to block wind, but cold still found its way up. The walls were vertical boards, covered inside with plaster, made from lime and sand and animal hair, applied over wooden lath strips. This plastering helped. It sealed some gaps and added a thin layer of insulation. But it was not insulation as we understand it now, it was a surface. Behind it, just the cavity of the wall frame and the exterior clapboards. No packed material, no barrier against the transfer of cold. Touch the wall on a January night, away from the chimney. Your hand would find it cold. Not freezing because the interior air held some warmth, but cool enough to feel the outside reaching in. Near the hearth, different. The chimney stone radiated heat to either side. You could stand with your back to the fire and feel warmth through your clothing. Turn around, face the room, and your back would begin to chill within minutes. The ceiling was low, 7 feet, perhaps 7.5. Heat rises, and a low ceiling kept that rising warmth closer to the people below. Above the main room, a loft space or two small chambers where children slept, access by ladder or narrow enclosed stairs. Those upper spaces were not heated except by whatever warmth rose through gaps in the floorboards above the main room. On winter nights, those chambers became cold boxes where the air felt scarcely warmer than outside. 2 windows meant limited daylight, even at midday. By 4 in the afternoon in deep winter, the light inside had gone dim and grey. The family had already begun burning candles, tallow dipped at home smoky and dim, or precious beeswax, if they kept hives. Firelight did most of the illuminating. The hearth gave enough light for work within 6 or 8 feet. Beyond that, shadows. Furnishings were spare. A table, benches, perhaps 1 chair with arms for the households. Senior member, a cupboard for wooden plates and pewter, pegs on the wall for coats and tools. The bed, a large one that belonged to the parents, stood in the warmest corner, positioned to benefit from the chimney heat radiating through the wall. A wooden frame on posts, rope strung across to support the mattress tick, curtains hung on a rail above that could be drawn closed around it. The house smelled of wood smoke, always, also cooking. Whatever had simmered or roasted that day, wool and bodies and tallow, onions hung in bunches, herbs dried on strings, a faint smell of livestock, because the barn stood close and people went back and forth and tracked the barn inside on their boots. Not unpleasant, familiar. The smell of a house where people worked. As evening came on, the temperature outside dropped. 20 degrees, 15. The cold pressed against every surface of the house, walls, windows, door, roof. The house was not sealed against this pressure. It yielded. Cold entered through the small gaps around the doorframe, through the spaces between wall boards that had shrunk as wood dried, through the chimney when wind blew down it, around the window frames, inside the fire burned, the stone warmed, the air in the room near the hearth stayed perhaps 60 degrees, comfortable enough if you were moving, working, wearing wool. Step 10 feet from the fire and the temperature dropped noticeably. Walk to the far corner and it might be 50 degrees. Breathe out and you wouldn't quite see your breath yet, but you would feel the difference. You would move back toward the fire. This was the house as winter settled in, not a furnace, not insulated, not sealed, a wooden structure with a fire at its center and a family that knew how to use fire, fabric, and the small warmth of their own bodies to survive what was coming. Night, 14 hours of it, and cold that would deepen until morning. The house divided itself by temperature, not by walls but by distance from the hearth. Stand with your back to the fire and you occupied the warmest zone. 3 feet away, 5 feet. Here the heat reached you directly, radiant warmth that soaked into wool and linen. Your face flushed. Your hands, held out, felt the glow. This was the zone where children played on coldest days, where the woman of the house worked her spinning, where evening mending and handwork happened because fingers stayed nimble. Turn and walk 8 feet toward the door. The warmth thinned. You felt it on your back still, but diminished. The air around you cooled, not drastically, not suddenly, but measurably. This middle zone, the center of the room, stayed perhaps 55 degrees on a deep winter evening. Tolerable. You could work here if you kept moving, setting the table, carrying dishes, walking back and forth to tend something. But you would not choose to sit still here for long. The far corners, the spaces farthest from the hearth, near exterior walls, became cold pockets. 50 degrees, 45. Cold enough that you felt it through clothing. Cold enough that standing still meant your body heat drained away into the surrounding air faster than the distant fire could replace it. Families didn't linger in these spaces. You went to the corner to retrieve something from a chest or take a tool from a peg. Then you returned to warmth. The door itself radiated cold. Not literally, it was wood, inert, but standing near it you felt the chill. Outside air at 15 or 20 degrees pressed against the planks. The door was thick, solid oak, but thermal transfer is patient. Cold moved through, more cold seeped around the edges where door met frame, despite the fit. Families sometimes hung a heavy cloth or blanket over the door at night, an extra barrier. Not to seal the gap, sealing was impossible, but to slow the transfer, to give the cold one more layer to move through before reaching the room. Windows lost heat faster than walls. Glass is thin. The glass available in the 1700s was thicker than modern panes, wavy and irregular, but still only an eighth of an inch of material between inside and out. 2 windows, each perhaps 16 inches square, not large by our measure, but large enough to matter. At night, families closed wooden shutters over windows, interior shutters hinged on the frame. This added a layer of wood and, more importantly, created a small airspace between shutter and glass. That trapped air slowed heat loss, not by much, but every small measure accumulated. The room above, call it the loft, existed in a different thermal world. Heat rises, yes, and some warmth from the main room drifted up through gaps in the floorboards. Enough to keep the loft space warmer than outside, but only just. No fire burned up there. No chimney passed through to radiate stored warmth. The roof, just above, was wood shingles over rafters. Snow on the roof helped insulate. 3 inches of snow has an R value, traps air, slows heat movement. But the space under the eaves still dropped to near freezing on the coldest nights. Children slept up there. Why send them to the coldest part of the house? Practicality. The main room needed to function as workspace. The parents' bed, large and positioned in the best corner, couldn't accommodate 4 or 5 children. Young bodies generate heat, and packed together under sufficient blankets, they could stay warm enough. The children didn't complain. They had never known different. This was simply where children slept. A proper bedchamber, if the house had one, a separate room on the main floor with walls and a door, was also unheated. The chimney might pass through it or form one wall, and if so, that wall offered some radiant warmth, but no fire burned in the room itself. Bedchambers were not living spaces, they were sleeping spaces. You entered them at night, already dressed for bed. You burrowed under blankets. You stayed there until morning. The air in a closed bedchamber on a January night might hover around 45 degrees, cold enough that your breath misted faintly, cold enough that getting out of bed required willpower. Families understood this geography. They didn't try to heat the whole house. The concept made no sense to them. Heat was a scarce resource generated laboriously by burning wood someone had cut, split, and carried. You used heat where you were. You moved your body to where heat was. At midday, you might work near a window for light accepting cooler air. In evening, you migrated to the hearth. Everything that needed doing after dark happened within 8 feet of the fire. Even around the hearth, cold existed. Sit on a bench facing the fire and your front warmed while your back stayed cool. The air itself layered. Warmer near the ceiling, cooler at floor level. Children sitting on the floor felt colder than adults on chairs. Heat moved up and away. It didn't pool. It didn't fill the room evenly like water in a container. It radiated out from the source, weakening with distance, rising toward the ceiling, escaping through the roof structure. At night, when the fire was banked and flame reduced to coals buried in ash, the warmth contracted further. The stone chimney still radiated heat. It had absorbed warmth all day and would release it slowly for hours, but without active flame, the air temperature in the room dropped steadily. By midnight, that main room might be 50 degrees. By dawn, 45. The family in their beds, surrounded by curtains and piled blankets, created their own small warm zones. Everywhere else, the room, the loft, the corners, the cold waited. This was the thermal landscape of a colonial house in winter. Not one temperature, but many. Not warm and cold, but gradations. A careful geography that shaped how people moved, where they worked, and how they prepared for the long vulnerability of sleep. The transition from day to night was not sudden in a colonial household during winter. It was gradual, deliberate, and occupied by necessary work. As the afternoon light began its early decline, 4 o'clock in December, perhaps 4:30 in late January, the family's movements shifted inward and closer to the fire. Tasks that could be done in dim light were completed first. A woman might continue spinning near the window as long as she could see the fibres clearly. A man might finish splitting kindling just outside the door, while his hands could still grip the hatchet without numbing. Children brought in the last armloads of firewood from the cupboard stack, making multiple trips to build the indoor pile that would sustain the household through the darkness ahead. There was calculation in this. The work that remained after full darkness arrived had to be work that could be done by firelight alone, and firelight was unreliable for tasks requiring precision. Mending could continue if the tear was simple. Whittling could proceed if the project was familiar. But anything requiring close vision or fine motor control had to be finished before the sun set completely. The evening meal fell into this transitional period. Preparation had often begun earlier, a pot of stew or porridge set to simmer in the afternoon, bread from morning baking, stored vegetables that required no cooking. The family ate, while some natural light still entered through the windows, not because there was any formal rule about timing, but because eating in full darkness, illuminated only by the hearth's glow, made everything more difficult. Spills happened. Food cooled rapidly in the air away from the fire. It was simply easier to eat while you could still see the bowl clearly. After the meal came the work that drew everyone into the fire's immediate radius. The family gathered close, not for abstract comfort or social ritual, but because the perimeter of usable warmth was small and the tasks required that warmth. A woman might sit directly beside the hearth to card wool or prepare flax, her hands needing to stay flexible. A man might work on a tool repair or tend to a harness, his fingers performing tasks that became impossible when cold stiffened the joints. Children might shell beans or corn into a shared basket, their smaller bodies clustered together on a bench. This proximity was functional. The temperature dropped rapidly, even 2 or 3 feet from the fire's center. You could feel the gradient if you extended your arm, warmth near the hearth, coolness at shoulder height, distinct cold along the floor where drafts moved freely beneath doors and through gaps in the floorboards. Candles, when used at all, were lit sparingly and primarily for tasks the firelight couldn't adequately illuminate. A candle might be set near someone sewing, the small flame providing the focused light needed to see the needle's eye. But candles were costly, made from rendered animal fat or beeswax from the family's own hives, and they were conserved. Many families made do with firelight alone, perhaps supplemented by a rushlight, a dried reed soaked in fat that burned with a weak, sputtering glow. The animals, if they shared the house, settled into their evening positions during this period. A dog might lie near the hearth, close enough to absorb warmth, but not so close as to be in the way of work. Cats found their preferred spots on benches or in corners where rising heat collected. In homes where livestock sheltered in an attached lean-to or the lower level of a banked structure, the sounds of their settling, shifting hooves, low breathing, the rustle of hay became part of the evening's background. Conversation during this time was often sparse and practical. The hinges need tallow. There's ice in the water bucket. Check the shutter latch on the north side. The work occupied hands and attention, and the cold that pressed against the house from all sides didn't invite lengthy discussion. Words themselves seemed to fall into the same economy that governed candles and firewood, used when necessary, otherwise conserved. The younger children began to show signs of fatigue first. A child might slow in their work, hands moving less purposefully through the pile of corn. Another might drift closer to a parent seeking proximity and warmth. These were signals, and the adults registered them while continuing their own work. Sleep for children would come earlier, their bodies requiring more rest and less able to sustain themselves through the coldest hours. As full darkness settled outside, the windows became black squares that reflected the fire's light back into the room. The world beyond the walls disappeared entirely. There were no streetlights, no neighbouring windows glowing with lamplight, no illumination of any kind. The darkness was total and finite, pressing against the glass and wood. Inside, the fire continued its work, the only point of light and warmth in a geography that had reduced itself to a single room, a small circle of heat, and the people gathered within it. This was the threshold. The day's work was completing. The night's preparations would soon begin. The transition was almost finished. The fire was not symbolic, it was not decorative. It was the mechanism that made survival possible. And every person in a colonial household understood this without needing to articulate it. The fire cooked food, dried clothing, provided light, and generated the warmth that kept the interior temperature barely tolerable. Without it, the house became uninhabitable within hours. The central chimney in most colonial homes rose through the middle of the structure, built from stone or brick mortared together, and designed to contain flame while radiating heat into the surrounding rooms. In a single-room house, one large hearth opened into the living space. In larger homes, multiple hearths might share the same chimney stack, serving different rooms but drawing their draught through the same flue. The hearth itself was a substantial feature, often 5 or 6 feet wide, deep enough to accommodate large logs, and tall enough for an adult to stand inside the opening if the fire was cleared. The floor of the hearth was stone or brick, level with or slightly raised above the room's floor. Iron implements hung from hooks or rested against the interior walls, cranes for suspending pots, trivets for holding vessels above coals, long-handled tools for moving logs and raking embers. Fire required constant management. It was not lit and then ignored. Throughout the day, someone monitored its state, added fuel when needed, adjusted the position of logs to maintain an even burn, and raked coals forward or backward depending on cooking requirements. Wood was not simply thrown onto flame. Logs were selected by size and type. Hardwoods like oak or maple burned longer and hotter. Softwoods like pine ignited quickly but consumed rapidly. The fire was built in layers with careful attention to airflow and coal formation. By evening, the fire had often been burning continuously since morning, sometimes for multiple days. The bed of coals beneath the visible flames was deep and established, providing a stable base of heat that radiated outward, even when flame itself was minimal. These coals were valuable. They represented stored energy, and they were far easier to build upon than to create from scratch. The decision facing every household each evening was how to manage the fire through the night. Letting it burn freely for 8 or 9 hours would consume enormous quantities of wood and create a fire hazard as the family slept. But allowing it to go out entirely meant waking to a cold house and the laborious, time-consuming process of rekindling flame using flint, steel, and tinder. A task that could take 15 or 20 minutes and required dry materials, steady hands, and patience, all of which were in short supply on a freezing morning. The compromise was banking, a technique for slowing the fire's consumption while preserving enough ember and coal to revive it quickly at dawn. This was skilled work, learned through practice and observation, and it varied depending on the specific hearth, the quality of the wood, and the severity of the cold. Banking began with arrangement of the fuel. Large logs, ideally hardwood, were positioned to burn slowly through the night. These were not placed haphazardly. They were set parallel or in a careful stack that restricted airflow between them, slowing combustion. The goal was smoulder, not flame. Once the logs were positioned, the coals were managed. Hot coals were raked into a concentrated mass, typically toward the back of the hearth, where they would receive less draft from the room. Additional coals were sometimes buried partially beneath the arranged logs, creating points of sustained heat that would gradually ignite the wood from beneath. Then came the ash. The fire produced ash continuously, and this ash was not waste. It was insulation. A layer of ash was carefully spread over the coals and the base of the logs, covering them enough to starve the fire of oxygen and slow its burn, but not so much as to smother it entirely. This required judgment. Too little ash and the fire consumed itself. Too much, and the embers died. Some families used a curfew, a metal cover, often domed or conical, that could be placed over the banked fire to further restrict air. The curfew sat directly on the hearth, enclosing the fire beneath it like a lid. It was not airtight, but it reduced draft significantly and provided additional insurance that the embers would survive until morning. A properly banked fire did not produce flame. It produced almost no visible light. From across the room it appeared as a dark mound with perhaps a faint glow visible through cracks in the ash or around the edges of the curfew. The heat it provided was minimal, enough to slightly warm the immediate area near the hearth, but not enough to maintain comfort throughout the room. This was acceptable. The fire's purpose during the night was not to heat the house, it was to survive. The house would grow cold regardless. What mattered was that when morning came and someone rose in the darkness to tend the hearth, they would find live embers waiting, responsive to bellows and kindling, ready to rebuild into flame without the ordeal of starting from nothing. The fire would sleep as the family slept, and if the banking was done well, both would wake. The fire had burned through the day. It had heated water and cooked food and kept the room tolerable while work continued within sight of its light. Now, as the family prepared to leave the common room and retreat to beds, a decision had to be made about what would happen to that fire while they slept. The simplest choice was to let it burn down and die. But simplicity carried a cost. A dead fire in the morning meant starting over from nothing. Flint and steel, char cloth, careful breathing on ember that might or might not catch. The process could take 10 minutes or 30, depending on conditions and luck. All of this would happen in a house that had spent hours growing colder, with fingers stiff and breath visible and every surface touched feeling like stone. So, the fire was not allowed to die. Instead, it was banked, put to sleep, in a manner of speaking, arranged and covered and left in a state where it would neither provide heat nor go out entirely, but would wait through the dark hours in a kind of suspension, holding a core of heat that could be revived when someone returned to it after dawn. This was a practiced skill, something learned by watching, refined through repetition, and passed between generations as common knowledge. The process had steps. They were performed in sequence deliberately as part of the evening's closing routine. The first task was selection. The person tending the fire, often the household's senior woman, though this varied, looked at what remained of the day's burning and identified logs worth keeping. Not small sticks that would be consumed in an hour, not green wood that would smoulder poorly. The goal was large pieces that would burn slowly and incompletely. Hardwood was best, oak or maple if available, dense wood that held structure even as heat worked through it. These selected logs were positioned toward the back of the hearth. A large piece, sometimes called the back log, was placed against the rear wall of the fireplace where it would receive heat but less direct flame. Another log, called the forest stick, might be set in front, creating a space between them. If the fire had burned down to mostly coals, fresh logs might not be added at all. What mattered was creating a configuration that would sustain combustion at the lowest possible intensity. Next came the coals themselves. These were not left scattered. Using a fire iron or poker, the hot coals were raked together into a concentrated pile. This was typically done at the center or slightly to one side of the hearth floor, depending on the household's tradition. The logic was insulation and mass. A single coal exposed to air would cool and die. A pile of coals pressed together retained heat within itself, each ember keeping its neighbours alive. Once the coals were gathered, ash was pulled over them. Not dirt, not sand. Ash from the fire itself, light, powdery, plentiful. It was raked from the edges of the hearth or scooped from where it had accumulated over days of burning. The ash was spread across the top and sides of the coal pile, covering it almost completely. An inch thick, sometimes more. The effect was insulation. Ash is a poor conductor of heat. It trapped warmth inside the pile while limiting the oxygen that reached the coals, slowing their consumption to nearly nothing. Beneath that blanket of ash, the fire was still alive, barely. It was not producing flame or visible glow. It was not giving off heat you could feel standing a foot away. But it had not gone out. Some families went further. They used a device called a curfew, from the French couvre-feu, meaning cover fire. This was a metal cover, often shaped like a wide dome or half-cylinder that could be placed over the banked coals. It served two purposes. First, containment. If a coal shifted or a spark escaped, the curfew caught it. Second, further insulation. Metal held and reflected heat back toward the coals, reinforcing the ash layer's work. Curfews were not universal. They cost money, required a blacksmith's work, and added a step to the process. Families without one managed perfectly well with ash alone. But in households that had a curfew, it became part of the rhythm. Bank the coals, cover with ash, place the curfew, step back. The entire process took perhaps 5 minutes, maybe less if you had done it 1,000 times. It was quiet work, no conversation needed. The room was already dim. Firelight, which had filled the space an hour earlier, was now reduced to almost nothing. The logs positioned at the back might hold a dull red glow along one edge, visible only if you looked directly at them. The ashed-over coals gave no light at all. What remained was heat, or the memory of it. The stones of the hearth still radiated warmth. The air in the room had not yet fully cooled, but the fire as a presence, as a thing you could see and feel and gather near, was gone. It would not keep anyone warm through the night. That was understood. The banked fire was not a heating fire. It was insurance against morning difficulty. It represented a choice to preserve something, not comfort, but continuity. The difference between waking to a task that was manageable and waking to a task that was miserable. And there was always the risk it would not work. A log could have been damp. The coals might not have been hot enough when covered. The ash layer might have been too thin or too thick. If too thin, the coals consumed themselves. If too thick, they smothered. A draught from a gap in the wall could pull heat away faster than the coals could hold it. By morning, there might be nothing left but cold ash, and the need to start over anyway. But most of the time, it worked. Most mornings, the person who rose first would approach the hearth and carefully pull back the ash covering to find a small red glow still waiting underneath. That glow would be fed, kindling added, gentle breath or bellows applied, and the fire would return. That was the goal. Not warmth now, but warmth later. Not comfort, but continuity. The banked fire was a thread carried through the night, thin and fragile, but usually enough. The fire was banked. The room was cooling. The beds themselves, up in the sleeping chamber or arranged near the edges of the common room, were cold. Not cool, cold. The linens had been sitting in the same air temperature as everything else, and that temperature had been dropping since the sun went down. No amount of blankets changed the fact that climbing into a cold bed meant pressing your body against cold fabric. That first contact was unpleasant enough that families with the means to do so took steps to avoid it. They borrowed warmth from the fire and carried it to the bed, not as flame or embers, far too dangerous, but as heated objects that could hold and release heat over time. Heavy things, dense things that would absorb temperature at the hearth and then give it back slowly once placed between linens. Stones were the simplest option, rounded river stones, pieces of field stone, anything fist-sized or larger that could tolerate high heat without cracking. A stone would be placed directly in the hearth, nestled among the coals or set near the fire's edge and left there while the family finished evening tasks. By the time the fire was banked, the stone was hot. Not glowing, but hot enough that touching it with a bare hand would burn. It had to be wrapped, usually in cloth, an old piece of linen or worn rag, something expendable. The wrapping served two purposes. It protected hands during the carry from hearth to bed, and it prevented the hot stone from scorching or igniting the bed linens. Once wrapped, the stone was moved quickly. Up the stairs, if the sleeping chamber was above, across the room if the bed was nearby, and placed between the sheets near the centre or foot of the bed. The heat it gave off was immediate, localized, but real. If you climbed into bed within a few minutes, that spot was warm. Not everywhere, only where the stone was. But warmth in one place was better than none, and body heat would eventually spread from there to the surrounding linens. Stones were common because they cost nothing, but they were also imperfect. They cooled relatively quickly. Often within an hour or two the warmth was gone. They were heavy and awkward, and if the wrapping shifted, a hot stone. Against linen could burn fabric or skin. Bricks were better in some respects. Fired clay held heat longer than stone. Bricks were uniform in size, easier to handle, and less likely to have sharp edges. Families that had access to bricks, those living near towns or who had built their chimneys with brick rather than field stone, would heat one or two the same way they heated stones, placing them in the hearth and transferring them to beds once they had absorbed enough warmth. Wrapped in cloth or slipped into a cloth bag sewn for the purpose, a heated brick could keep a bed warm for 2 or 3 hours, sometimes longer. Wealthier households had warming pans. These were purpose-built tools. A metal pan, typically brass or copper, with a flat circular base perhaps 8 or 10 inches across and a long wooden handle. The pan had a lid, often pierced with decorative holes that let heat escape in a controlled way. You filled the pan with hot coals from the hearth, closed the lid, and carried it by the handle to the bed. Once there, you moved the warming pan back and forth between the sheets, running it across the length of the mattress and letting the heat from the coals radiate into the fabric. The motion was slow and deliberate. Too fast, and you didn't transfer enough warmth. Too slow, or left in one place, and you risked scorching. The goal was even distribution, chasing the cold out of the linens so that when you removed the pan and climbed in, the bed felt tolerable. A warming pan cost money. It required a smith to make, and metal was not cheap. The long handle had to be sturdy enough to support the weight of the pan and coals without bending or breaking. Not every household had one, but those that did used it almost every winter night. The coals inside the pan stayed hot longer than a stone or brick because they were still technically burning, consuming themselves slowly even inside the closed container, but they also required care. The lid had to stay on, the pan had to be kept away from anything flammable, and once the coals had done their work, they had to be returned to the hearth or safely disposed of, not left smouldering under a bed. For families without stones, bricks, or pans, there was only body heat and blankets. You climbed into a cold bed, pulled the covers tight, and waited for your own warmth to accumulate. It worked, eventually. But the first 10 or 15 minutes were hard. Children especially struggled. Small bodies generated less heat and felt the cold more sharply. Some families addressed this by sending children to bed first before the adults, while the common room was still slightly warmer. The children would huddle under blankets and begin the work of warming the bed with their collective body heat. By the time the parents finished banking the fire and joined them or retired to their own bed, the children's spot had become more tolerable, and the adults could warm their own space more quickly without having to manage cold, complaining children at the same time. The practice of pre-warming beds was not about luxury. It was a small efficiency in a season where efficiency mattered. Morning came whether or not you had slept well, and sleep came easier if you were not shivering. So warmth was carried, stones from the hearth, bricks from the fire, coals in a metal pan, heat borrowed and transferred, briefly held, and slowly lost again as the night deepened and the house gave itself over to cold. But for an hour, perhaps two, the bed was warm enough, and that was often enough to let sleep arrive before the cold returned. The bed was not simply furniture. It was a piece of survival equipment designed and built with winter specifically in mind. A colonial bed stood elevated on a wooden frame. Not for appearance, not for ease of making. The height served a practical function. It lifted the sleeper above the coldest layer of air in the room. Cold air settled. It pooled on floors, especially plank floors with gaps and cracks that let drafts rise from the dirt or cellar below. To sleep on the floor in winter was to sleep in the coldest zone of an already cold house. The bed frame created distance, 1.5 feet, sometimes 2 feet. That elevation placed the sleeper in air several degrees warmer than the space below. The frame itself was simple, 4 posts, usually turned from maple or oak, side rails connecting them, and across those rails, a lattice of rope, the rope bed. Required maintenance. Hemp or flax rope, woven in a tight crosshatch pattern from head to foot and side to side, formed the support structure. Over time the ropes stretched. They sagged under weight and use. A sagging bed meant a poor night's sleep, but more practically it meant the sleeper sank closer to the cold floor zone. Tightening the ropes was a regular task. You worked your way around the frame, pulling the rope through its holes in the rail, taking up slack, re-knotting where necessary. The phrase that has survived, sleep tight, may well have referred to this task. A tight bed was a bed properly strung, one that held its sleeper high and level, but the frame alone was not enough. On top of the rope, lattice sat the tick. This was the mattress, though that word suggests a single finished object. The tick was a large fabric sack sewn from sturdy cloth, filled with whatever material the family could provide. For wealthy families, that meant feathers, goose down specifically. A feather bed was a luxury, but not in the modern decorative sense. It was thermal technology, down-trapped air. Each feather created tiny pockets where warmth could gather and hold. A well-made feather tick was thick, sometimes a foot deep or more. You did not sleep on top of it, so much as sink into it. The down surrounded you. Below, it insulated you from any cold rising through the ropes. Above, if you used a second feather tick or bolster, it enclosed you. Geese were valuable in the colonial economy for many reasons: meat, grease for cooking and waterproofing, quills for writing. But their feathers, especially the soft down from the breast, were irreplaceable for winter survival. A family with a flock of geese had a renewable source of insulation. Poor families had no such resource. Their ticks were filled with straw, wheat straw, rye straw, or the coarser stems of corn stalks after harvest, sometimes dried grasses, sometimes the chaff left after threshing grain. Straw was free, or nearly so. It could be gathered from fields or barns, but it performed poorly compared to down. It compressed under weight. A fresh straw tick, newly filled in autumn, might provide decent cushioning. By midwinter it had compacted into a thin, uneven layer that did little to block cold from below. Straw also broke down. It crumbled into dust. It poked through the fabric, and it provided no loft, no air-trapping structure that could hold warmth the way feathers did. Some families used wool scraps, or wool that had felted and could no longer be spun. This was better than straw. Wool retained warmth even when compressed, even when damp from condensation. But wool was too valuable to bury inside a tick when it could be woven into blankets or clothing. Only families with surplus sheep or access to wool waste from fulling mills used it as fill. The tick, once filled, was sewn shut, sometimes with a gap left in the stitching so the filling could be refreshed or replaced. Sometimes fully closed, meant to last the season or longer. You placed the tick directly onto the rope lattice. Then you made the bed. First a base sheet, linen, woven from flax grown in the family's own fields, or purchased from a local weaver. Linen was smooth against skin. It wicked moisture. It could be boiled clean. Cotton, at this point in the 18th century, was rare in colonial America. Expensive. Mostly imported. Linen served. This bottom sheet covered the tick and tucked around its edges. It created a clean barrier between sleeper and stuffing. Then came the wool. Wool blankets were the core of the system, heavy, woven blankets in natural greys and browns, or sometimes dyed with plant colours. A single blanket was not enough. Families layered them, 2, 3, as many as they owned. Wool had a quality that made it irreplaceable for winter sleep. It insulated even when damp. Breath condensed in cold rooms. Moisture formed. Cotton would grow clammy. Linen would chill. Wool continued to trap warmth. The weave mattered. A tight, fulled weave blocked drafts. A looser weave allowed air circulation, useful in moderate cold but inadequate in deep winter. Families knew their blankets, which ones to use in November, which ones to add in January. On top of the blankets, a coverlet or quilt. Coverlets were woven bed covers, often made on large looms, patterned in geometric or floral designs. They added another layer of weight and warmth, and their tighter weave served as a top barrier against drafts. Quilts were different, pieced together from scraps of fabric, worn-out clothing, leftover weaving, bits of imported cloth, too small for garments. These scraps were sewn into patterns, backed with another layer of cloth, and filled with a thin batting of wool or cotton. Then the whole assemblage was stitched through in regular patterns to hold the layers together. A quilt was not as warm as a thick wool blanket, but it was proof against wind. It sealed the layers below, and it cost almost nothing to make, only time. Families with resources had all of these: feather tick, linen sheets, multiple wool blankets, a coverlet, perhaps a quilt as well. The bed became a layered system, each component serving a specific role in trapping and holding the body's heat. Families without resources made do with less: a straw tick, a single blanket, perhaps a worn quilt, handed down or pieced from rags. The bed, in either case, was the most important object in the house for winter survival. It was where you spent a third of each day. It was where children, elderly family members, and the sick spent even longer. If the bed failed, if the tick was too thin, if blankets were inadequate, if the frame sagged and dropped you into the coldest air, winter became not just uncomfortable, but dangerous. So the bed was built carefully, maintained, filled with the best materials the family could afford or produce. Because when the fire burned low and the night cold settled in, the bed was what stood between you and the winter. Once the bed itself was prepared, the work of layering began. The bottom sheet was already in place, tucked tight around the tick. This stayed put unless it needed washing, which in winter happened infrequently. Water was difficult to heat in large quantities. Linen was slow to dry in cold air. So the bottom sheet remained, and the rest of the bed was built on top of it. You started with the sleeper's body as the heat source. Everything else was designed to trap what the body produced and prevent it from escaping into the freezing room. The first layer touching skin was the night shift. For adults, this was a long linen shirt, falling to the knees or below, loose enough to allow movement, but covering as much skin as possible. Women wore shifts similar to their undergarments. Men wore long shirts that resembled the shirts worn during the day, but cut fuller. Linen against skin served a purpose. It absorbed moisture. Bodies perspired even in cold, breath condensed, dampness formed. Linen pulled that moisture away from the skin, preventing the chill that came from wet fabric clinging to the body. Children wore the same, long shirts, often handed down and rehemmed as they grew. The night shift stayed on all night. You did not remove it. In the coldest months, some people slept in even more. A second shirt, a waistcoat for extra warmth over the chest, bed socks knitted from wool. Over the legs, some families used additional coverings, a blanket wrapped specifically around the lower body before climbing fully into bed. Or heavy stockings pulled up over the knees. Cold affected the extremities first, feet, hands. Keeping them covered mattered. Once dressed, you entered the bed. The top sheet came next if the family had one. Not all did. A top sheet was linen like the bottom, and it lay between the sleeper and the wool blankets above. This kept the wool from directly touching skin and absorbing sweat or oils. Wool was harder to wash than linen. Protecting it extended its usefulness. Then the blankets. The first blanket was often the lightest, not light in weight, but lighter in thickness compared to what would follow. It lay flat across the bed, covering the sleeper from shoulders to feet. Tucked in along the sides if there was enough fabric, if not, simply laid across. The second blanket was heavier, fulled wool, tightly woven, dense enough to block drafts. This one mattered. It was the primary insulation, the layer doing the most work. If the family owned a third blanket, it went on next. This might be older, more worn, but still functional. Wool did not stop insulating just because it had thinned or developed holes. Every layer contributed. On the coldest nights, a fourth blanket, or a heavy coverlet woven on a large loom, patterned and thick. The final layer was often a quilt. Quilts were not puffy, lofted objects like modern comforters. Colonial quilts were relatively flat. 2 layers of fabric, often pieced tops made from scraps, backed with a solid piece of worn linen or homespun, with a thin batting of wool or cotton in between. The 3 layers were stitched together in running patterns, lines, diamonds, or simple grids. This stitching held the batting in place and prevented it from shifting or bunching. The quilt's role was not primarily warmth, though it added some. Its role was wind blocking. It sealed the layers underneath, Drafts that might penetrate through the weave of a blanket stopped at the quilt's tighter fabric. Some families had quilts made from wealthier fabrics, imported cottons, printed calicos, even small pieces of silk or fine wool. These were display objects as much as functional ones brought out when guests visited or used on the best bed in the house. But most quilts were humbler, pieced from worn shirts, old skirts, leftover weaving. The colours faded, the fabrics mismatched. They were records of the family's clothing over years, each square a fragment of something once worn. A well-made quilt could last decades. It could be repaired, patched, rebacked when the original fabric gave out. Families passed them down. A quilt made by a grandmother might cover her grandchildren, the fabrics unrecognizable, but the warmth still present. With all the layers in place, the bed was heavy. The weight itself was part of the system. It pressed down on the body, held the layers close, prevented gaps where warm air could escape. Modern sleepers might find it claustrophobic. Colonial sleepers found it necessary. The edges mattered. If a blanket was too narrow, cold air crept in along the sides. If it was too short, feet were exposed. Families learned to tuck and fold. A blanket pulled up high over the shoulders, then folded back down to create a double layer over the chest. A quilt tucked tightly along the body's sides, trapping warmth in a sealed envelope. For children sleeping together, the layers were shared. 2 or 3 children under the same blankets, their combined body heat warming the space between them. The smallest child often slept in the middle, benefiting from warmth on both sides. For adults, sleeping arrangements varied. A married couple shared blankets. The combined warmth of 2 bodies was more effective than each sleeping separately. Older children might share a bed in another room or in a loft space. Servants, if the household had them, slept where they could, sometimes in the kitchen near the banked fire, sometimes in unheated lofts with whatever blankets could be spared. The wealthiest families had more textile resources, extra blankets stored in chests, quilts for each bed, coverlets in multiple weights for different seasons. They could rotate bedding, wash it more frequently, replace it when worn. Poor families had barely enough. A single blanket shared among children. A quilt so worn it was more whole than fabric, but still used because something was better than nothing. In the poorest households, people slept in their daytime clothes, using their own garments as additional insulation, because there were no extra textiles to spare. The difference between adequate bedding and inadequate bedding was the difference between sleep and suffering. With enough layers, the body's heat accumulated. The space within the blankets became a small, warm zone. Not hot, not even truly comfortable by modern standards, but warm enough that sleep was possible. Without enough layers, the body fought all night. It burned energy trying to stay warm. Extremities went numb. Sleep came in shallow, restless intervals. Morning arrived with the person exhausted, cold stiff, no more rested than when they lay down, so the layering was not casual. It was methodical. Each textile placed deliberately, tucked, folded, arranged to create the best possible defense against the cold that would settle in once the fire burned low and the night deepened. The bed, with all its blankets and quilts, became a small fortress. Outside it, the room grew colder. Inside it, if you had built the layers correctly, warmth collected. You pulled the covers up to your chin, you felt the weight pressing down, and you waited for sleep, trusting that the work you had done, the preparations, the layering, the careful arrangement, would be enough to carry you through until morning. The clothing you wore to bed in a colonial house during winter was not a matter of comfort or modesty alone. It was insulation. It was another layer between your body and the cold that settled into every corner once the sun dropped below the horizon. You did not undress completely. That would have been dangerous. Instead, as evening chores ended and the family moved closer to the fire for the final hour before sleep, you changed from daytime work clothes into garments designed specifically for stillness. A long nightshirt, usually linen, sometimes wool if the household could afford it. The fabric reached past your knees, often to your ankles, loose enough to allow you to pull your legs up toward your chest if the cold became sharp during the night. Long sleeves that covered your arms completely. These were not delicate garments, they were sturdy, practical, and often patched. A nightshirt might last years, handed down from parent to child, mended at collar and cuff until the fabric thinned past repair. Over your head went a nightcap, always. This was not optional, not decorative. The human head releases an enormous amount of heat. In a freezing room, that heat escaped into the air and was lost. A nightcap, knitted wool or sewn linen, depending on what the household had, kept warmth close to your skull. It tied under the chin or fit snugly enough to stay in place through the night. Children wore them. Adults wore them. Even infants, bundled into cradles near the fire, had small caps fitted over their soft heads. Women with long hair braided it before bed. This kept it from tangling, but it also kept it contained under the cap, preventing the mass of hair from drawing heat away from the scalp and neck. Men and boys, if their hair was long enough, did the same. Your feet were next. Cold floors conducted heat away from your body faster than almost any other surface in the house. Bare feet on wide pine planks in January was not merely uncomfortable, it was a way to lose body warmth you would not easily recover under blankets. So you wore socks to bed, knitted wool socks, thick and slightly oversized. Sometimes 2 pairs if the night promised to be especially brutal. If your household didn't have socks, you wrapped your feet in cloth, strips of old linen or wool wound around the foot and lower ankle, then tucked into themselves to stay in place. Some families, particularly those in the coldest regions of New England or in households where someone suffered from poor circulation or illness, wrapped additional fabric around their lower legs. Not formal clothing, just insulation, wool scraps, old petticoat fabric, anything that could be wound and tucked and would stay put through hours of stillness. Children were dressed in similar fashion. Their nightshirts were smaller versions of adult garments, their caps just as essential. Families with multiple children often had each child wear an extra wool shawl or small blanket draped over their shoulders before they climbed into the shared bed. This created a secondary layer that moved with them, stayed in place better than a blanket that might be kicked off in sleep. In wealthier homes, some people owned bedgowns, heavier robes made of quilted fabric or layered wool that could be worn over the nightshirt. These were considerable garments, more insulation than clothing, and they signaled prosperity. A household that could afford a dedicated quilted bedgown for each adult was a household with resources. Most families did not have these. Most families had nightshirts, caps, and socks. That was the uniform of winter sleep. You changed near the fire. The common room in the last minutes before the family moved toward their sleeping spaces became a changing area. There was no separate dressing room. Privacy was limited. You turned your back, pulled the daytime dress or shirt over your head, and quickly pulled the nightshirt down before the cold could settle fully against your skin. Children changed in clusters, helping younger siblings with ties and caps. The smallest ones were often dressed for bed while standing on the hearth itself, where the stones still held warmth from the fire. Their bare skin was exposed for the shortest time possible. Once dressed, you did not linger. The clothing you wore to bed would keep you warm only if you added it to the other warming strategies: heated stones, layered blankets, shared body heat, and the enclosed space of the bed itself. The nightshirt and cap were part of a system. Alone, they would not be enough, but without them, the rest would fail. So you tied your cap under your chin, you pulled your socks up past your ankles, you checked that your children had done the same. And then you moved toward the bed, carrying with you every degree of warmth you could preserve, dressed for the long, cold stillness of a winter night in a house that offered only what you could gather and hold close until morning. The bed you approached in a colonial winter was not merely a piece of furniture. If your family had means or even modest resources carefully applied, it was an enclosure, a smaller room within the larger cold room, a space you could control. 4 poster beds, when fitted with heavy curtains on all sides, became fabric tents. This was their purpose, not decoration, not status alone, though they did signal a household with resources. The curtains created a boundary between your body and the air of the room. They trapped the warmth you brought with you, the warmth from the stones you carried, the heat your body generated, the warm breath you exhaled, and kept it from dissipating into the freezing space beyond. The physics were simple. A smaller volume of air is easier to warm. A room might measure 12 feet by 14 feet, with a ceiling 8 feet high. That was more than 1,000 cubic feet of air to heat, and without the fire burning actively through the night, that air would drop toward freezing. But the space inside bed curtains, perhaps 4 feet wide, 6 feet long, and 5 feet tall at the canopy, was a fraction of that. 120 cubic feet. Your body heat, concentrated in that smaller space, could raise the temperature noticeably. Not warm, not comfortable by modern measures, but several degrees higher than the room. Enough to matter. The curtains themselves were heavy. Wool was common in households that could afford it. Thick woven wool, sometimes lined with linen or layered with a second fabric for added insulation. In wealthier homes, the curtains might be quilted. 2 layers of fabric with wool batting between, stitched in patterns to hold the filling in place. These were not light drapery, they were textile walls. You closed them deliberately, starting at the foot of the bed, pulling the fabric panels across the openings between the posts. Side curtains next, drawn fully to meet at the corners. Finally, if your bed had them, curtains at the head, though many beds left the head open or only partially curtained, since that side often faced the wall or chimney, which provided some radiant warmth. Once enclosed, the space inside became noticeably different. Darker, even if a small candle or hearthlight had been visible before. Quieter, the fabric dampened sounds from the room. And gradually, as you settled under blankets and your body warmed the air immediately around you, the temperature inside the curtain bed rose above the temperature outside it. This microclimate was measurable. Historical accounts and later studies of similar enclosures suggest a difference of 5 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit between the inside of a fully curtained bed and the open room. If the room dropped to 35 degrees overnight, the air inside your bed curtains might hold at 40 or 45. That difference determined whether you could sleep or whether you lay awake shivering, unable to let your muscles relax into true rest. Not every household had four-poster beds with full curtain sets. These were investments: a bed frame with posts, a canopy frame, and 4 panels of heavy wool fabric represented significant expense and labour. Families passed them down through generations. They appeared in estate inventories as valuable property. But even modest households created enclosures when they could. A simple wooden bed frame without posts could still be partially enclosed. Families hung fabric from the ceiling beams, old blankets, pieced together scraps, worn-out cloaks, creating makeshift curtains on 1 or 2 sides of the bed. A curtain along the side facing the room's interior blocked drafts from the door. A curtain at the foot stopped cold air that pooled near the floor from creeping upward under the blankets. Some families, particularly those in single-room homes where everyone slept in the same space, used curtains to create partitions. A length of heavy fabric hung from a beam could separate parents' sleeping area from children's, or divide sleeping space from living space. These curtains served modesty, but they also trapped warmth in smaller zones. In the coldest homes, those in northern regions or poorly constructed houses with significant gaps in the walls, families sometimes enclosed the entire bed area more permanently. They built simple wooden frames around the bed and attached fabric or even wooden panels to 3 sides, leaving only the side facing the hearth open. This created a box bed, a concept borrowed from European traditions and adapted to colonial necessity. The air inside any of these enclosures grew thick with breath. In a fully curtained bed shared by multiple people, condensation sometimes formed on the inside of the fabric by morning. Tiny droplets of moisture from exhaled air meeting cold cloth. This was accepted. The dampness was preferable to the alternative, which was losing body heat to the open room all night. You learned to sleep inside enclosure. The darkness was deeper. The air felt closer. If you woke during the night and needed to leave the bed, to check a child, to use the chamber pot, to add wood to the fire, you had to push aside heavy fabric, and the cold beyond rushed in immediately. You moved quickly, then sealed the curtains again as soon as you returned. Children raised in these beds understood the curtains as part of sleep itself. You did not thrash or kick in a curtained bed. You stayed still, because stillness conserved warmth and kept the carefully created microclimate stable. You did not open the curtains idly. You kept the enclosure closed until morning, when someone, usually the first adult to rise, opened them to let in the slowly warming air of the household as the fire rebuilt. The bed, enclosed and dark and shared, became a vessel. It held your warmth, it blocked the cold, it gave you a space small enough to defend against the winter pressing in from all sides. And when morning came, you emerged from it into a cold room, but you had survived the night. That was the measure of success. The question of who slept where in a colonial household was never simply about preference. It was a careful calculation of vulnerability, warmth, and hierarchy, made fresh each winter night. In homes with multiple rooms, the allocation followed patterns shaped by cold. The parents occupied the bed nearest the hearth. This was not luxury, it was acknowledgement of their role as the household's operational core. The people who would rise first, who needed rest sufficient to labour through the next day, whose survival meant the family's continuation. The best bed, if the family owned one with a proper feather tick and intact curtains, stood in this warmest position. This placement also allowed parents to tend the fire through the night without fully dressing or crossing cold rooms in darkness. A mother could rise, add wood, and return to warmth within a few steps. A father could check shutters or investigate sounds without waking the entire household. Children slept together, typically several to a bed, in arrangements that shifted with age and season. The youngest might remain in a cradle or trundle near the parents' bed, particularly infants still nursing through the night. Older children shared beds in colder parts of the room, away from the hearth's immediate radius. These arrangements were not accidental. Shared body heat transformed beds holding 3 or 4 children into warmer environments than any single sleeper could achieve alone. Children's smaller bodies generated less individual heat, but clustered together under shared blankets, they created collective warmth that made colder sleeping positions survivable. The geometry of these sleeping clusters varied. Younger children might sleep between older siblings, borrowing warmth from both sides. The largest child often took the outer edge, acting as windbreak against drafts, seeping through walls. Feet might interleave at the bed centre, or children might sleep top to tail, maximising coverage under limited blankets. Arguments over position were inevitable. The spot nearest the wall was coldest, but offered protection from falling out. The middle position was warmest but most crowded. The outside edge allowed easier rising for chamber pot use, but exposed the sleeper to room air. These negotiations played out nightly, shaped by age, size, and the previous night's grievances. In single-room homes, all sleeping happened in the same space. The main room became a chamber of beds arranged around the hearth's warmth gradient. The parents' bed occupied the prime position. Children's beds, whether full frames or simple pallets, extended outward in order of decreasing warmth. The arrangement resembled concentric rings, with the fire as the centre and cold as the expanding perimeter. Servants, or apprentices, if the household included them, slept in whatever space remained. In 2-story homes, this often meant lofts, spaces directly under the roof, where summer heat was punishing but winter cold was absolute. These upper chambers received no direct warmth from the hearth below. What little heat rose through gaps in floorboards dispersed quickly against roof boards and exterior walls. A servant might sleep in the kitchen if the household had a separate cooking space, benefiting from residual warmth in baking ovens or cooking hearths. Some slept in workrooms or storage areas, anywhere that offered walls and a horizontal surface. The assumption was that youth and lower status conferred greater cold tolerance, an assumption born more from necessity than truth. Elderly family members presented the opposite calculation. Grandparents or aging relatives often received sleeping positions second only to the household heads, sometimes sharing the warmest bed if infirmity or illness demanded it. Their presence added complexity to nighttime arrangements, but also additional body heat, and often the wisdom of experienced fire tenders who woke naturally through the night. In homes with attached livestock spaces, barns built continuous with living quarters or animals stabled in lower levels, the shared wall provided passive heating. Human sleeping chambers positioned against these walls benefited from cattle or horses radiating warmth through the barrier. This was not incidental. Home construction deliberately placed sleeping areas where animal heat could transfer inward. The practice of bringing certain animals fully indoors during extreme cold was a pragmatic extension of this logic. A large farm dog sleeping on the floor near children's beds contributed measurable warmth. The phrase three-dog night described cold severe enough to warrant 3 dogs as bed warmers, each animal a living heat source requiring no fuel, only scraps and tolerance of fleas. Cats served similar function with less mass, but greater willingness to sleep directly against humans or burrowed under blankets. Their presence was tolerated in proportion to the cold's severity. A household that would never permit animals on beds in autumn might wake in January to find children and cats in an indistinguishable pile. These arrangements were not fixed through the winter. Illness reshuffled sleeping positions as sick children moved nearer parents for monitoring. Severe cold might collapse the household into fewer beds, maximizing shared warmth. A child's growth might promote them from the outer edge to the warmer middle position. The social geography of sleep was also a map of vulnerability and value. Those who slept warmest were either most essential or most fragile. Those who slept coldest were presumed hardy or expendable, their comfort sacrificed to the mathematics of limited warmth and space. There was no privacy in this arrangement. Sleep happened in proximity that erased boundaries, breath audible, movement felt, through shared mattresses, body heat mingling under communal blankets. Winter made privacy a luxury the cold could not afford. This was survival shaped like intimacy. Not closeness chosen, but closeness required. Bodies arranged not by affection, but by the cold's demands. The household at night became a single organism of shared warmth, each member positioned according to need and function, waiting together for morning. The human body at rest generates approximately the same heat as a lit candle, roughly 100 watts. For a single sleeper in a cold room, this warmth dissipates into surrounding air, absorbed by frozen walls and drafts moving through gaps in construction. The sleeper must produce enough heat not only to maintain core temperature, but to warm the envelope of air trapped under blankets, the fabric layers themselves, and the mattress beneath. This is an losing equation in temperatures below freezing. One body cannot generate sufficient warmth to create comfort. It can manage survival, but only under heavy textiles that themselves require body heat to become effective insulators. 2 bodies change the mathematics entirely. Each additional person in a bed contributes another 100 watts of continuous heat. 2 sleepers generate 200 watts, the output of a modest space heater sustained automatically through the night without fuel or tending. This warmth accumulates in the shared space between bodies and under communal blankets, creating a microclimate several degrees warmer than the surrounding room. The efficiency increases with proximity. Bodies separated by even a hand's width lose much of the benefit, their heat escaping into the gap between them. Bodies touching transfer warmth directly through skin and fabric with minimal loss to surrounding air. The mathematics favor the tight cluster over the spread arrangement. This explains why colonial children slept 3, 4, sometimes 5 to a bed. Each additional child increased the total heat output and decreased the volume each body needed to warm. A bed holding 4 children didn't require each child to heat 1/4 of the space. The shared warmth meant each child contributed to a collective thermal mass that benefited all. The arrangement worked best when bodies varied in size. Larger children generated more heat and covered more surface area. Smaller children fit into gaps, reducing empty space where cold air might accumulate. The ideal configuration placed the largest child as windbreak on the outer edge, medium children as insulation in between, and the smallest child in the center, where warmth concentrated. Age added another factor. Adults generated more heat than children, greater body mass, higher resting metabolism. An adult sleeping between 2 children effectively became a human furnace, radiating warmth to both sides. This was why infants often slept with parents despite the risks. A baby's small body generated minimal heat and lost warmth rapidly. Pressed against an adult's torso under blankets, the infant existed in a pocket of warmth otherwise impossible to maintain. Gender mattered less than size and output. A large teenage son produced more warmth than his smaller mother. A working-age daughter generated more than her elderly grandfather. The mathematics were purely thermal. Who contributed most to the collective heat, who needed most from it. Position within the bed formed a gradient from warm to cold. The center of a multi-person bed surrounded by bodies on all sides and buried deepest under blankets might be genuinely comfortable, warm enough for rest without shivering. The outer edges, where cold air met exposed blanket surfaces and the sleeper's back faced the room, remained significantly colder, despite shared warmth. This created the nightly negotiation of placement. Everyone understood the middle was warmest. Younger children claimed this spot by virtue of need. Older children accepted colder edges as the price of size and age. Arguments erupted over fairness, over who had suffered the cold edge the previous night and deserved rotation to the center. Some families formalized the rotation. Each child took turns in each position, cycling through the week so that cold nights on the edge balanced with warm nights in the middle. Other families assigned positions by age and left them fixed, accepting hierarchy as the organizing principle. The arrival of an additional sleeper improved conditions for everyone already present. When visiting relatives or travelers required accommodation, squeezing another body into an already occupied bed made the bed warmer rather than merely more crowded. The inconvenience of reduced space was offset by the benefit of additional heat. This was the logic behind tavern keepers placing 3 strangers in a single bed. Privacy suffered and comfort diminished, but warmth increased. For travellers arriving frozen from hours on horseback or in open wagons, the promise of shared body heat outweighed the awkwardness of sleeping pressed against unknown bodies. The practice extended to emergency situations. On the coldest nights when banked fires failed or fuel ran short, families collapsed sleeping arrangements entirely. Parents and children who normally occupied separate beds might consolidate into one, stacking bodies and blankets to maximize shared warmth. These nights erased ordinary arrangements in favor of pure thermal efficiency. Animals contributed to the same mathematics. A large dog sleeping on the floor beside a bed raised the ambient temperature near the bed's edge. A dog, permitted onto the bed itself, lying across children's feet or pressed against their backs, added perhaps 30 watts of continuous warmth. Not as much as another human, but enough to matter. A cat burrowed under blankets against a child's stomach might contribute 10 watts. Trivial in isolation, but meaningful in the accumulated budget of nighttime warmth. The calculation was involuntary but precise. Bodies unconsciously moved toward warmth and away from cold during sleep. Children sleeping together would wake in configurations different from how they began, shifted toward the center, limbs overlapping, the pile reorganized by sleeping bodies seeking optimal warmth. This was survival disguised as closeness. The shared bed was not primarily about affection or family bonds, though these existed. It was about thermal efficiency, about the mathematics that made 3 children warmer together than apart, about adding human bodies until the total heat output exceeded the cold's ability to drain it away. The result was warmth borrowed from each other, sustained through the long night by the simple accumulation of breathing, sleeping bodies generating their modest, continuous heat. Not comfort by modern measure, but adequacy, not warmth by choice, but warmth by calculation. Enough to sleep, enough to survive until morning, enough to repeat again the following night, the same bodies in the same arrangements, sharing the same warmth through another winter darkness. There was a practice in many colonial households that later generations would find peculiar, occasionally scandalous, and difficult to explain. It was called bundling, and it happened in winter, at night, in bed. A young man and young woman courting with the knowledge and supervision of her family would spend evening hours lying together in the same bed, clothed, often wrapped individually in separate blankets or sheets, sometimes with a wooden board placed lengthwise between them, the door to the room left open, parents aware, listening from the next room. This was not secret. This was not improper by the standards of the families who practiced it. This was courtship, conducted under the constraints of a house where winter made most spaces uninhabitable after dark. The practical problem was simple. A young man might visit a young woman's family home in the evening. They needed space to talk, to become acquainted, to determine whether they wished to marry. But the common room was occupied by the entire family, parents, siblings, possibly grandparents, all gathered near the only fire. Privacy was impossible. Conversation drowned in the noise of many people in close quarters. The unheated parlour, if the family had one, offered privacy, but became brutally cold after sunset. Sitting there for hours in winter temperatures without a fire was unpleasant to the point of being impractical. Fingers grew numb. Conversation became difficult through chattering teeth. The cold itself cut the evening short, so the couple would retire to a bedroom, and they would lie in bed together under blankets, clothed in their daytime garments or in heavy night clothes, and they would talk, for hours sometimes. The bed provided warmth. The arrangement provided enough separation to satisfy propriety as the family understood it. The open door and thin walls provided parental supervision. The board between them, when families used one, was typically a wide plank, perhaps 8 or 10 inches across, placed under the blankets along the center of the bed. A physical barrier, a reminder of boundaries, not foolproof, but a tangible reinforcement of the rules governing the practice. In houses where bundling occurred, it was understood that the couple would remain clothed, and that certain intimacies were forbidden. The practice was meant to allow conversation and companionship in an environment warm enough to sustain several hours of stillness. Many families considered it an acceptable compromise between the needs of courtship and the limitations of a winter house. Not everyone approved. Ministers wrote against it. Travellers from Europe observed it with surprise and sometimes disapproval. Even within colonial communities, some families refused the practice outright, considering it too great a temptation, regardless of precautions. But in rural areas, in houses where the common room was small and families large, bundling persisted. It reflected a practical calculation. The winter house had no private warm spaces for extended occupation. Courtship required time and conversation. The bed solved both problems. The custom eventually faded. Changing social attitudes increased prosperity that allowed for heated parlours, shifting ideas about privacy and propriety, all contributed to its decline. By the early 19th century, bundling had become a source of embarrassment, something remembered as a strange practice of an earlier, less refined generation. But in the coldest decades of the 1700s, in houses where warmth was scarce and carefully allocated, it made a certain sense. The bed was the warmest place. Courtship was necessary. Supervision was possible. The cold dictated terms that later generations living in heated homes would not need to accept. When morning came, the young man would leave. The board, if used, would be removed. The bed would return to its usual occupants, and the courtship would continue this way through multiple visits, through weeks or months of winter evenings, until a decision was made or the practice ended. This was how warmth shaped behaviour, how the architecture of the winter house influenced social customs, how cold became a factor in determining what was acceptable and what was not. The household, as it settled for the night, was not always composed only of humans. Dogs slept inside during the coldest stretches, not in every house and not every night, but often enough that it was unremarkable. A farm dog that spent daylight hours outside working or wandering might be brought in when temperatures dropped severely. It would lie near the hearth or at the foot of a bed or in the space between the bed frame and the wall. The dog provided warmth. A sleeping dog generated body heat. Lying against it or simply sharing a room with it raised the ambient temperature by a small but noticeable degree. On nights when the cold was profound, this mattered. Cats, too, were tolerated indoors with greater frequency in winter. A cat that hunted in the barn during warmer months might spend December and January inside, curling on laps near the fire in the evening or burrowing under blankets at night. Cats sought warmth instinctively, and their presence was often welcome for the same reason. There is a phrase, 3-dog night, that suggests a scale of cold measured by how many dogs one needed to sleep beside for warmth. The coldest nights required 3, moderate cold 1 or 2. The phrase itself may not have originated in colonial America, and its exact historical accuracy is difficult to confirm. But the principle it describes was real. People did sleep with animals for warmth, not as a preferred luxury, but as a practical response to cold that threatened comfort and sometimes safety. Children especially might share sleeping space with a dog. A child in a loft bedroom, far from the hearth, could curl against a large dog and sleep warmer than they would alone. Parents understood this and allowed it. The dog was not a pet in the modern sense. It was working livestock most of the time, but it served this additional function when needed. In houses where livestock were kept close, the warmth of animals was even more direct. A cow or several sheep in an attached shed, separated from the living quarters by only a thin wall, radiated heat that warmed the adjacent room. This was not accidental. Farmers built structures with this in mind, positioning animal shelters against the house so their warmth would contribute to human comfort. The animals benefited too. Keeping them closer to human habitation often meant they had some access to residual warmth from the household fire. Survival rates for livestock improved when they were not left fully exposed to the worst of winter. Some families brought smaller animals, lambs, piglets, directly into the house during birthing or extreme cold. A newborn lamb might spend its first days in a box near the hearth, not for sentimental reasons, but because it would not survive the barn. The kitchen became a temporary nursery, warm enough to keep fragile young animals alive until they were hardy enough to withstand outdoor temperatures. This intermingling of human and animal sleeping spaces would later be viewed as unhygienic, undesirable, a marker of poverty or primitiveness. But in the 1700s, it was normal. The boundaries between household and farm were less rigid. The cold required cooperation across species. Not every family did this. Wealthier households with larger homes and better heating might exclude animals entirely. But for common farming families, the ones living in small houses with single fireplaces, animals were part of the strategy. The dog by the bed, the cat under the blanket, the cattle in the attached structure, all of them contributing small increments of warmth that together made the night more bearable. By morning, the dog would be let out. The cat would retreat to the barn. The household would separate again into human and animal spaces. But for the duration of the long winter night, the distinctions blurred. Warmth was warmth, and it came from whatever source was available. The last preparation is complete. The warming pan has been withdrawn from beneath the covers, returned to its hook by the hearth. The bed curtains have been drawn closed on 3 sides, left open only toward the fire, so that whatever warmth it offers might reach the enclosed space. The household has settled into position, children nested together toward the center, parents at the edges where cold presses closest, each body arranged to share heat and conserve it. Now comes the surrender to night. The darkness is nearly complete. A small glow persists from the banked fire, visible as faint orange through the gap in the curtains, but it illuminates nothing. It simply exists. A reminder that embers wait beneath ash, that morning will bring the possibility of flame again. Beyond that glow, the room holds only black, not the darkness of a modern bedroom where streetlights leak around curtains or digital clocks cast blue light across walls. This is the darkness humans knew for thousands of years before electricity. Absolute. Disorienting if you opened your eyes, the kind of darkness where your hand 6 inches from your face remains invisible. The silence settles differently than darkness. It is not complete, but it is profound. Wind moves against the house, a low sound, steady, occasionally rising to press harder against wooden walls and shutters. Snow may be falling outside, though it makes no sound. Inside, the fire occasionally shifts. A log settles slightly as it burns through in one spot, not collapsing but adjusting its weight with a soft crack or hiss. Someone's breath catches in sleep. Not quite a snore, just the sound of air moving through a throat at rest. A child coughs once, muffled by blankets, then returns to stillness. These sounds do not fill the silence. They punctuate it. The temperature inside the curtained bed enclosure begins to stabilize. Body heat collects in the small space, held by wool and linen and the fabric walls that separate this microclimate from the larger room. It is not warm, 50 degrees at most, perhaps slightly higher near the center where three bodies press close, but it is less cold than it was, and the contrast feels significant. The initial shock of sliding between cold sheets has passed. The stones wrapped and placed near feet still hold faint warmth. The layered blankets have begun their work of trapping what heat the bodies produce. Beyond the curtains, the room grows colder. The fire burns lower. Heat rises toward the ceiling and dissipates. The walls exhale cold inward. Frost begins to form on the inside of the shuttered windows, thin crystalline patterns spreading across wood, moisture from cooking and breath and the day's activities now freezing in place. The floor, never warm, becomes colder still. By the deepest part of night, perhaps 2 or 3 hours before dawn, the temperature in the room will reach its lowest point, 40 degrees. Possibly lower, cold enough that breath would be visible if anyone rose and lit a candle to see. But no one rises yet. Sleep takes hold in stages, arriving more easily for children whose bodies generate heat efficiently when bundled together, more slowly for adults who remain half aware of the cold at their backs. The need to pull covers tighter around shoulders, the adjustment of position to minimize exposed surface area. Sleep in a colonial winter bed is not the unconscious collapse of exhausted modern people into soft mattresses in climate-controlled rooms. It is deliberate. The body must relax enough to allow rest but remain organized, limbs tucked close, head covered, no gaps in the blanket layers where cold might infiltrate. Some families prayed before sleep. Specific words for protection through night, for the household's safety, for the fire to hold, for morning to arrive without disaster. These prayers were not merely ritual. They acknowledged real risks. Fire could spread from hearth to floor. Illness could worsen in cold. A storm could intensify to dangerous levels. Children could grow too cold, despite all preparations. Morning was not guaranteed to arrive with everyone well. The night extends forward into hours that cannot be measured without clocks, that are marked only by the body's internal sense of time passing. Deep winter nights in New England could last 14 hours from sunset to sunrise, 14 hours of this darkness, this cold, this waiting. The household does not experience all of it consciously, but sleep in these conditions is not the solid 8-hour block that modern sleep studies measure. It is lighter, more fragmented, aware on some level of discomfort that never entirely disappears. A child wakes briefly, uncertain why, feeling cold at the shoulder where the blanket has shifted slightly. The child adjusts, pulling fabric back into place and finds warmth again near a sibling's back, returns to sleep. The father wakes when his arm, extended slightly beyond the covers, begins to ache with cold. He draws it back, tucks his hand beneath the blanket against his chest, waits for feeling to return. Does not fully wake, but does not fully sleep either for several minutes. Drifts back under. This is how the night proceeds, not as unbroken rest, but as a series of sleeps and small wakings, adjustments and returns to unconsciousness, the body managing cold and position and the sharing of space through semi-conscious coordination. Hours pass this way, the wind continues outside, the fire burns lower, giving less light, producing less heat, but still maintaining its core of ember and coal beneath the ash that insulates it. The house creaks occasionally as cold tightens wooden joints. Snow may accumulate on the roof, adding weight, muffling sound further, and the family endures. Not comfortably, but adequately. Surviving another night through preparation, through layers, through proximity, through the knowledge passed down about how to arrange yourself for sleep when warmth is scarce and morning is distant. The night does not pass unbroken. Sleep in a colonial winter household arrived in segments, interrupted by need, by cold, by the body's refusal to remain entirely unconscious when survival required some portion of awareness. Historians examining pre-industrial sleep patterns found references throughout diaries, letters, and literary sources to what they termed first sleep and second sleep. People retired early, slept for several hours, then woke naturally in the deep middle of night. They remained awake for an hour, sometimes two, praying, tending to small tasks, lying quiet in darkness. Then they returned to sleep until dawn. Whether this pattern was universal or common remains debated, but the evidence suggests that uninterrupted sleep was not the expectation. The body woke. You accepted this. You waited. You slept again. In winter, these wakings had specific textures. You woke because your shoulder had grown cold, where it pressed near the edge of the bed, away from other bodies. You woke because a child beside you had shifted and pulled the shared blanket, creating a gap that admitted freezing air. You woke because your bladder insisted, because you had drunk cider or water with evening meal, and now, hours later, the body demanded relief. You woke because you heard wind intensify against the house, or because unusual silence suggested snow had deepened outside, or because some instinct said to check, to make certain everyone still breathed, still had cover, still maintained warmth enough to last until morning. The chamber pot served essential purpose on these wakings. It sat within reach, sometimes under the bed, sometimes in a corner of the room, always accessible without the need to fully dress or venture outdoors. Using it required leaving the accumulated warmth of the bed enclosure, pushing aside curtains, sitting up into air that immediately pressed cold against face and hands, fumbling in darkness for the earthenware or metal vessel. This was done quickly, not from modesty, though privacy was scarce, but from the urgent desire to return to the blankets before body heat dissipated entirely. The pot would be emptied in morning, its contents taken to the privy or midden. For now, it simply allowed the night to continue without the impossible task of dressing, unbarring the door, and crossing frozen ground to an outdoor structure in complete darkness. Children woke more frequently than adults. Their smaller bodies lost heat faster, their sleep cycles were shorter, their awareness of discomfort less disciplined. A young child might wake crying from cold, from bad dreams, from the general misery of winter night. The mother woke in response, checking, adjusting blankets, sometimes pulling the child closer, sharing her own warmth directly, shushing, soothing, not with many words. Speaking into cold darkness was unpleasant, but with touch and presence, waiting for the child to settle back into sleep before attempting to find it herself again. The fire required attention not every night and not in every household, but when cold pressed especially hard, when the house had not been built well, when wind found gaps in walls, someone might rise to add wood. This was decided before sleep. On ordinary winter nights the banked coals would hold until morning, and no intervention was needed. But on the coldest nights, when temperatures outside dropped towards zero, when storms brought wind that stripped heat from walls, the family might agree that someone would rise once in the dark hours to feed the fire. This task rotated or fell to whoever was judged most capable. Sometimes the father, as head of household, sometimes a grown son. Occasionally the mother, if she was already lightest sleeper due to tending children. Whoever took the duty understood what it required, leaving the bed entirely, standing in a room where temperatures had dropped into the 40s or below, approaching the hearth in darkness, guided only by faint ember glow, uncovering the banked coals carefully so ash did not scatter or smother flame, placing new wood without causing collapse or sending sparks toward the floor, waiting long enough to be certain the wood caught. That flame spread and held, all of this while wearing only night clothes, while breath turned visible, while cold penetrated skin and muscle and made hands clumsy. Then the return to bed. Climbing back between covers that had cooled slightly in absence, drawing curtains closed again, tucking limbs inward, waiting for shivering to subside as blankets slowly re-warmed the body. It could take a quarter hour to stop shaking, to find comfort again, to relax enough for sleep to return. By then the room would be slightly warmer. The new wood would be burning properly. Morning would be easier because of this intervention, the fire not reduced to bare coals, the room not as bitterly cold at dawn. Some households kept watch more formally. In homes where illness was present, where an infant needed frequent tending, where injury or age made someone vulnerable, a family member might remain partly vigilant through the night, not fully awake, but not deeply asleep either, listening, ready to respond. This was exhausting work, done out of necessity rather than choice, and it rotated when possible so that no one person bore the burden night after night. Animals sometimes woke the household, a dog barking at some sound outside, real or imagined. Chickens disturbed in their coop by a fox or weasel attempting entry. Cattle lowing in the barn, audible through walls if the structure was attached or very near. These sounds penetrated sleep, caused a moment of assessment. Is this urgent? Does it require response? Can it wait until morning? Usually it could wait. Occasionally someone rose, pulled on coat and boots, took a lantern if available, or moved by feel and memory, went to check livestock, found them safe or found damage that needed immediate remedy, then returned, frozen through, to a bed that seemed impossibly distant from the cold reality of the winter night outside. The long hours continued this way, sleep and waking, small adjustments, brief ventures from warmth into cold and back again. The household existed in a state between rest and vigilance, doing what was necessary to endure, making it through one more night with the knowledge that tomorrow night would require the same patience, the same small acts of resilience, the same careful balance between survival and rest. Through the night, someone might wake, not from restlessness, from cold that had found its way through blankets, or from the instinct that the fire had burned too low. In particularly harsh weather, a household might plan for this, deciding before sleep that someone would rise once in the deep hours to add wood. The duty rotated or it fell to whoever proved most tolerant of cold, often the same person, winter after winter. The decision to rise required fortitude. The bed held accumulated warmth, body heat trapped in wool and linen, the shared presence of others, the fading memory of the warming stone placed hours earlier. Beyond the curtain or blanket wall lay air cold enough that breath became visible. The main room would be several degrees warmer than unheated chambers, but not warm. The fire would have burned to coals perhaps lower. Its light would be faint. Rising meant leaving the only warm place that existed. It meant bare feet or stockinged feet on frozen floorboards. It meant fumbling in near-total darkness, guided by ember glow, barely sufficient to see the hearth's outline. One moved carefully. The room's geography had to be known from memory, where the corner of the table stood, where the wood pile was stacked, where the poker rested. At the hearth, the person knelt or crouched. Coals still lived beneath ash if the banking had been done properly. A few pieces of wood, placed carefully to avoid smothering what remained. Perhaps a gentle blow of breath to encourage flame. Not too much. Cold air could extinguish as easily as revive. The wood would catch, or it wouldn't. If it did, warmth began to rebuild. Slowly. The person might wait a moment, hands extended before returning to bed. The task complete. The house secured for the remainder of night. Morning began before light. The first riser, typically the wife, the mother, the senior woman of the household, left bed while others remained beneath blankets. She moved to the hearth in darkness or near darkness, to the place where coals had been preserved through 8 hours of night. This was practiced motion. She had done this thousands of times. The coals were raked gently, ash cleared from their surface, bellows applied, leather lungs pushing air in controlled rhythm. Not aggressive, steady. The coals brightened, orange deepening to yellow at their edges, small kindling added, twigs bark, splinters of pine. These caught. Flame appeared, low and tentative, then stronger. Larger wood followed, pieces chosen for how they would build heat without smothering the young fire. The fire grew. She worked by its light. The room remained cold, but the source of warmth was re-established. Water needed warming. The morning meal needed preparation. Others in the household could remain in beds until the main room reached tolerable temperature, children especially. They stayed cocooned while the house transitioned from night's deep cold to days slightly lesser cold. Getting dressed happened near the fire, not in bedchambers. Layers were added in stages, the body adjusted incrementally. By the time the household fully woke, flame was steady, heat was rising, and another day could begin. Frost remained on windows, interior surfaces and exterior. This was ordinary, expected. One checked for fresh snow, for depth of accumulation, for whether paths would need clearing before livestock could be tended. The night had been survived. The fire had held, the banking had worked, and morning proved once again that preparation and knowledge could carry a family through winter's coldest hours. The night had been survived. When the first member of the household rose in darkness, usually the senior woman, sometimes a grown daughter, and moved to the hearth, that moment represented the beginning of victory. Not comfort, not ease, but the successful completion of another winter night and the beginning of the work that would carry everyone through one more winter day. She knelt beside the banked fire. The coals beneath the ash layer might still glow faintly, or they might appear completely dead. She used the poker gently, disturbing the ash covering to reveal what remained underneath. If embers showed, she added small kindling. If the fire had died completely, the morning became longer and harder. The house warmed slowly, degree by degree. The air nearest the hearth first, then the space extending outward. Others remained in their beds, conserving warmth, waiting until the room reached a temperature where dressing became possible without fingers going numb. Frost covered the windows, interior frost, formed from the household's own breath condensing and freezing on cold glass overnight. Exterior frost as well, or snow pressed against the panes if wind had blown during darkness. The thickness of interior frost told part of the story, how cold the night had been, how much moisture the sleeping family had released into air, too cold to hold it. Water had frozen. The bucket kept indoors might have a skin of ice across its surface. The well outside would need its ice broken. Preparing morning water meant effort before anyone could drink or wash or begin cooking. Morning light, when it came, revealed the night's snowfall. How much had accumulated? Whether paths would need clearing, whether travel beyond the immediate yard would be possible. These assessments happened early, shaping the day's potential. The children woke last, called from beds only when the room had warmed enough and when their labour was needed. The transition from the warmth of shared blankets and shared body heat to the still, cold morning air remained a shock, even with fire rebuilt. This pattern repeated, night after night, week after week, the entire length of winter, which in New England could mean November through March. Hundreds of nights, hundreds of mornings that began the same way, testing the coals, rebuilding the fire, waiting for warmth to spread, assessing what the darkness had brought. Colonial families did not expect comfort, they expected adequacy. Enough warmth to sleep, enough fire to wake, enough preparation in summer and fall to make winter survivable. The knowledge of how to manage these things, how to bank coals, layer blankets, position beds, time the night's routines, passed from parents to children as essential information, as practical as knowing when to plant or how to preserve food. Making it through to spring was the victory. Each morning was a smaller victory within that larger one. The long winter night in colonial America was not a single experience, but hundreds of repeated experiences. Families who survived, and most did, through knowledge and preparation, did so through practiced routines, accumulated resources, and the understanding that comfort was not the goal. Warmth enough to sleep, and waking to rebuild the fire was sufficient. This quiet resilience, this nightly repetition of small, careful actions, carried generations through seasons that killed the unprepared. Let that steady rhythm stay with you now as you settle into your own night, your own warmth, your own darkness.